creating an authorizing environment, or what we call a brave space, not just a safe space, helped create a context in which people would risk it. And once they risked it, the benefits were huge.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of Socially Democratic, your weekly center-left politics and organizing podcast out every Friday that dives into the progressive campaigns, issues of the day, and the people leading from home and abroad. Today's episode is a part of a special collaboration between Socially Democratic Podcast and the Leading Change Network. It's a 4-series episode released each Friday in July 2024. Leading Change Network is a global community of organizing practice and learning, working to build people power for a more just, sustainable, and democratic world. We use an evolving framework developed by Marshall Ganz at the Harvard Kennedy School and his associates. Through our programs, we work to connect ideas, build learning spaces, and develop relationships towards organized people power. We coach and support leaders, campaigns, and organizations. We offer learning opportunities to develop leadership and build trainers and coaches. We create spaces where our global community can actively learn from and support each other through online sessions and member-led groups. We create and document resources for pedagogical development. We are organizing practitioners, educators, and organizations from 75 countries, and we invite you to join our community as organizations or individuals. Individual membership is $100 a year, and you can access all of our learning opportunities and resources and be part of a vibrant global community. Please visit leadingchangenetwork.org to become a member or contact info@leadingchangenetwork.org for more information today. In this series of podcasts, we are going to highlight campaigns from around the world that use the community organizing framework. After the opening episode with Marshall Ganz, each following episode will focus on each of the 5 leadership practices: public narrative, relationship building, team building, strategy, and action. We hope these episodes inspire you to further explore and practice organizing.
We are taping this one on a Tuesday afternoon at the Kennedy School of Government on the campus of Harvard University in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And sitting opposite me is a man that has, through his own leadership as both a community organiser and academic over the past, I was just trying to add this up, 50 years I think you've been at it. Correct me if I'm wrong, Marshall. Has enabled the leadership of others, including myself, right, to organise communities, build power, to solve problems and create lasting change. Marshall Ganz, welcome to Socially Democratic.
Thank you. That's a great welcome. Much appreciated.
We appreciate your leadership, and I appreciate your time today for coming on the show. Our loyal listeners that tune into the show week after week often hear me talking about Marshall Ganz, organising, community organising, public narrative, the story of self, us, and now. So often I think that they start to think that you're my uncle or something, but...
no such luck.
No.
Of mine.
Indeed. But when preparing this episode, I was sort of thinking, where do we begin? How do we start this conversation? And I thought, Stephen, you're an idiot. You should think about your own practices. Well, we should start with your story of self. So, Marshall, can I ask you if you would share your story of self?
I grew up in California. Well, I grew up from age 7 in California. My father was a rabbi. My mother was a teacher. And we lived in Germany for 3 years after the Second World War. He was a chaplain in the American Army. And... I was a little kid then, but the realities of what was happening around us were there. Aside from the bombed out houses and all that, there were always people coming through our house, survivors of the Holocaust, and even wasn't called a Holocaust yet, but there was all this around. My grandmother lived with us, and her brother had been deported to Auschwitz from Paris. And so there was a lot of that. It was real. My 5th birthday party was in it was a DP camp, displaced person, that it was all children, which at first I thought was pretty cool until I understood that it was the parents were gone. That's why it was all children. so that was a reality, and but my parents and my mom, really important. She grew up in Virginia. Her folks owned a store outside the naval base there. They came from the old country, and she grew up with a real sense of what was called brotherhood in those days. And so what we were experiencing was interpreted to me as not being simply about anti-Semitism, but about racism. And I'm really grateful for that because it sort of helped me understand that when you do racist stuff, you know, you turn people into objects. You can do anything with them. And, of course, that kind of sensibility has been very, very important to me. We came back to the States and lived in D.C. for a couple of years. My father had a hard time. He was working as a congregational rabbi. Well, that's one of the most political jobs in the world. And because, you know, there's always the party that's for the rabbi against the and so forth. But he was later diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. It was really hard for him, the relational work. And so he got stuck there in D.C. for a couple of years, and it was a hard time. And he became less and less available to me. And it sort of got worse. And I think that I developed a lot of anger around that. And that was another part. It's kind of, I think of my mom's love of learning and creativity and imagination. She was a teacher, called herself an educator, taught me that the word education comes from educere in Latin, which means to draw out, not to put in, you know, to bring out people's capacities as opposed to filling their heads with stuff. But the grappling with the sort of tensions around my father, it sort of turned into feelings about arbitrary power. You know, do it because I say so. Or why no? No. There was something about that was very visceral. And, you know, later on, I began to see that's what was happening in the South. That was it was institutionalized, that kind of stuff. And I think sort of the combination of those things, you know, had an influence on me, such that when I got to college and, you know, I was trying to find my way here, this was 1960, and it was the year John Kennedy was elected president, and he came here to the Yard not long after. It was like all of a sudden I was in this place that was like close to history. It was also very, very, very elitist. I mean, it's elitist now. You should have seen then. We had more African students than African American students in my class. We had like 4 African American students, and the ratio of men and women was totally different. And the prep schools, I'd never heard of these places, Exeter, Andover, but you know, they all knew faculty by their first names. It was very, but at the same time, it was just incredibly stimulating. And so I was trying to sort of find my way through this, and did 2 years, and then lived in Berkeley for a year because I had a girlfriend out at Mills College, and we were trying to figure out what's up with us. But it was also, I was trying to figure out where to focus. Well, that was an interesting time to be in the Bay Area, that 62, 63. It was, I remember Pete Seeger did this concert at the Longshoremen's Hall, where he did this whole medley of civil rights songs. And he made the point that this was a movement of young people, again and again. And it sort of confronted me with that. Oh, it's a movement of young, what am I? Oh, I guess I'm a young person. Oh, what's happening here? And it was very challenging and inspiring at the same time. And that was, you know, went to Monterey to hear Bob Dylan. Like, it was an interesting time. But then that summer was Medgar Evers was assassinated. The 4 little girls were killed in Birmingham. The police dogs, all of that was happening that summer of 63. And so I came back to school. I had decided finally what I was going to do my undergraduate work on. It was going to be on the Weimar Republic, and it was particularly going to be on the Berliner Ensemble, which was Bertolt Brecht's theater. It's theater of agitation, theater of politics, and I was really interested in the interaction of culture and politics and how those things work. But I also met Dottie Zellner, who was organizing the Friends of SNCC here, and her husband was the first white guy to actually join SNCC. He was from Alabama. And civil rights just became more and more like, this is real. And when President Kennedy was assassinated, it was like a real shock because, it was like a breach. Like, what the hell? And in a way, it sort of turned into, nobody's going to do this for you. If you're going to do something about this, you got to do it. And so I got more involved with civil rights work then, and it became much more compelling than the Weimar Republic. And so I volunteered then for the Mississippi Summer Project, and that really was a life changer. It was, in a couple of ways, learning that black is safe and white is scary was a new experience for me. Refuge was in the black community. Refuge was being put in jail with black people. To be put in jail with white people was not a good thing in Mississippi. And so it was this whole inversion of sort of what had been thought of one way into a whole different way. And that was really helpful. It was really, for me, enormously helpful. Learning how to cross cultural and class barriers. I had this mentor, Hollis Watkins. He was like 2 years older than me, but 31 years older in organizing experience. He'd been working there in Mississippi. And I asked him about, how do I do this? White Jewish guy from Harvard here in Mississippi. And we were talking in the car, and he pulled off the road. He said, okay, here's what you got to do. He said, you have to listen, but learn from what you're listening, what you're hearing. You have to ask questions, but really digest what's coming. And that if you give respect, you'll get it. That was a lesson about respect and about what respect means. And respect is something that's so being challenged when you think about what it's like to be seen and know you're being seen, to be heard and know you're being heard, to be valued and know you're being valued. That's so fundamental for human beings. And it was a real gift because it helped me understand how to work across some of these boundaries. And the other thing was that, I'd always been sort of had to be an outsider growing up. It was, my father got a pulpit finally in Fresno and then in Bakersfield, but Friday night was football time, not for me. I was off to hear my dad, and so it was always this kind of marginal sensibility. I discovered in Mississippi that I didn't have to be an insider. I could be an outsider, but I could work in a way such that my agency was linked to supporting the agency of those who were fighting and in struggle. Because it never was about, these poor people. It was all about what I admired was the fight. My first SNCC meeting I went to in Mississippi, or in Georgia, was in a sanctuary of a seminary. And I thought I'd go in and see maps and all this stuff. And they were having a preach-off. Now, if you know what a preach-off is, who could imitate Dr. King better? And it was hilarious. And it was, there was this sense of joy and of celebration and courage. Man, that was appealing. Why would you want to be part of that? And so that was kind of the attraction, but it's where I then began to learn this role of organizing. or teaching. It's not that, and that there was a way to do that and be effective in that way and not have to worry about, do they like me or not? Respect really mattered. So I just learned so much in Mississippi. And I guess the last thing I'll say is when you grow up Jewish, you grow up, the story you grow up in is much more central to your identity than the place. It's a diaspora culture. And so narrative becomes a really important understanding of who you are. Abraham was your grandfather or whatever. It's that kind of thing. Well, here I was in Mississippi and going to Baptist church like at least 3 times a week. And the cool thing was that having been raised with religious sensibility, some of my what were called red diaper baby friends couldn't get it. But I got what was happening. It was another narrative. In fact, it was the same narrative I grew up with. The Exodus story. And it was being celebrated. It was a form of solidarity. Song was so important in that movement because of the way in which music allows us to synchronize emotion and express together, solidarity, and the whole role of faith in hope in that setting. And so I learned a hell of a lot from that. And at one point I was even asked to teach Baptist Sunday school, but it was adult Sunday school in the morning where they have a lesson, and a lot of I knew a lot of the scripture, so that was helpful. But then going to California and seeing a world that I grew up in but had not seen, farm worker world. I talk about getting Mississippi eyes. Come back and see another community of people of color, without political rights, without economic rights. In California, with its own rich history of racial oppression, really, since the native peoples and Chinese, Japanese. And it helped me understand that Mississippi was just not an exception to America, but an example of the America we needed to change. So now I found myself in the Mexican world, Roman Catholic. It was an exciting time in the Catholic Church. Vatican II had just happened. There was a lot of opening. There were a lot of religious, like Mary Knowles and others, who had been in Central America, in Guatemala or Salvador. So it was a very dynamic moment. And learning then about all those narratives and how that story worked. And that was just another really telling experience. But that's where I learned the craft of organizing. I learned the calling in Mississippi. The craft came with the farm workers because organizing was serious business. I mean, Cesar brought the guy who trained him to train us. And, if you can't count it, it didn't happen. I mean, it was really no bullshit. And that was, what a gift that was. Because, it's one to say, oh, we're one with the people. Oh, isn't that nice? It's another thing to start counting how many came to the meeting. Well, why not? Well, who came, who didn't? Why did they come? It's just this constant commitment to learning from experience in such a way that you improve and get better. Boy, that was a huge gift to farm workers. So, no, that was just kind of another deal. So I don't know. I'm going on a bit long, but those are some of the things that because when I left the farm workers, it was 10 years of trying to figure stuff out. A movement like the farm workers, which is full-time, volunteer, no salaries. I mean, it's like a religious order. And you come out sort of rubbing your eyes saying, what the hell's going on out here? And so it took me a while to figure that out and did a lot of electoral stuff. But it felt like I was being used all the time. It wasn't, something I think I got from Mississippi and farm workers was your people, they're not instrumental. They are the object. In other words, they are the subject. It's like what you're trying to do is enable people to constitute power in themselves and in their communities that wasn't there. And in some ways, the objective of a campaign is an excuse for that. So it isn't all about winning the campaign. Of course you want to win. But the question is, have you built more power? Have people? So it's like people being at the center of the thing. The campaign matters, all the rest, but essentially it's about people. It's about human beings. And I read Fratelli Tutti recently, Pope Francis' encyclical, We Are All Brothers. And in it, he distinguishes between what he calls liberation theology and what he calls people's theology. And liberation theology, which was a very important movement in the 60s for the Catholic Church, but it became very abstract, very sort of ideological in a certain kind of way. That was sort of, how do you fit people into those categories? What he was saying is, you start with people, and you generate the ideas and the concepts from human beings. And that's kind of what we've tried to do with the organizing, focusing on these basic practices that every human being is capable of. We all tell stories, we all build relationships, we all strategize. And so there's trying to sort of put people at the center of the work. And that wasn't happening there for me. And so that's when I got invited to my 25th reunion here. I was shocked that I was even invited. And that was another sort of choice moment of like, hey, I'd just been working with Jerry Brown trying to rebuild the California Democratic Party, which is a very thankless proposition. Well, when I came here, I realized, I may need to push reset. And it was a good choice because then, came back, finished my senior year. And it was stressful, but boy, I was like, just like a fish out of, I was just so hungry. And it was great. And I was in these classes with me, the professor, and all juniors in college. And it was good. Again, it was I think there's something about learning across boundaries that really energizes me, whether it's generational or cultural or whatever it might be, that there's certain richness there. And so I got hooked, and, I never thought I'd be teaching at Harvard. This is like, so, life is a matter of choice and chance. And I think there's a lot of hubris in trying to say, I'm going to plan my next 30 years. There's hubris in I'm going to plan my next 5 years. It's much more about how you equip yourself to deal with the chances and the opportunities based on what's going to enable you to grow and to be who you can become. So, yeah.
Listening to you...
Quite a sermon.
No, first of all, thank you for sharing that, Marshall. But listening, there's so much to unpack from all of that. But listening to that story, I can't help but identify the journey that I've gone through as well, because I remember when I was at university, I spent more time on other campuses trying to win student elections and getting involved in, I guess, student politics or campus politics than actually finishing my degree. I remember my father sitting down with me at one point saying, your mother and father, we work hard to put you through college.
Yep.
And we're seeing you pissing around with this other sort of stuff. And I didn't know how to communicate to him that I felt this was important, that I needed to do this. This was my urgency that I needed to act on. And I didn't finish my degree at that moment either.
Okay. We're brothers.
Yeah, absolutely. Which I felt at some point ashamed about it. But it was only and then I went into the union movement, and it was maybe 10, 15 years later that someone said, Stephen, you need to go back and get your degree. And I did do that, and I enjoyed the experience. But cool. Talking about learning...
I didn't realize that, Stephen. That's cool.
Well,
to know that.
It was only when I enrolled in the Leadership Organising and Action program through the executive education here at Harvard that I really started to appreciate growth and Carol Dweck growth mindset stuff.
Growth mindset stuff is really good stuff.
Really made me think about, actually, Stephen, if you are you need to grow. You don't know the answers to everything, and you need to accept that and actually use this as a moment to develop your own skills and the practice of leadership and organising.
What got you into those politics? I mean, why are you doing all that?
I knew you were going to ask me that question. Way back?
Yeah.
I joined I joined the Labor Party when I was still in high school
Why?
because, well, before that, I grew up in a sort of a Labor family, but we weren't political.
Yeah,
Always talking about politics at the dinner table.
yeah.
But my family weren't activists. You know,
What did they do?
Dad was a painter, like a tradesman,
Yeah.
and Mum was a homemaker.
Yeah,
They immigrated from Scotland in the late 1950s.
okay.
And at the time in my own state, the state of Victoria, the Conservatives were running the show, running government, and they were prioritising everything. And a lot of the coal industry in my community was getting privatised.
Yeah.
And a lot of my cousins lost their jobs.
Oh.
And at that moment, I thought, I didn't realise that work could be precarious. I just thought we all got jobs.
Oh.
And I remember Dad also saying that, you know, it was impacting on his ability to get work. And so I sort of thought, oh, I need to do something about this. And I remember there was a rally coming up in Melbourne, which is probably 2 hours away from where I grew up.
Yeah.
And I said, I want to go. And Mum and Dad said, no. And I couldn't understand why. I said, we're Labor people. We should be going to this rally. And my sister's going. She's a school teacher. Why can't I go?
Yeah.
And they're Scottish, obviously. They said, you're just trying to get to school. So you're not doing that. And it was maybe 5 months later, there was a federal election on.
Yeah.
And Labor were in government, but they were supposed to lose.
Yeah.
And I couldn't even vote, but I went down with my mum and dad just to have a bit of sticky beak.
Yeah.
And as they went into vote, there was a guy handing out like how to vote cards
Yeah.
at the polling station. And I just walked up to him and I said, can I give you a hand? And he said, sure. And he gave me a wad full of papers and he said, go stand over there.
This was high school.
Yeah. And it was in my hometown as well, which is a conservative town. So now I'm showing everyone my politics.
Yeah.
Which
Where did you get the guts for that?
I just thought Paul Keating, who was the Prime Minister then, was a bit of a hero of mine. And I thought if he loses, then we'll have a Conservative government, both state and federal, and then there's going to have a blank cheque to do whatever the hell they wanted.
Yeah.
So I thought, I need to do something right now. And I don't know whether this is going to make a difference.
There's a difference between I think I need to and I think I can.
I don't know. I don't know where I don't know where that came from.
No, it's just interesting because not everybody turns it into action. And then you've also got to sort of stand up to what I'm supposed to be in this mold on this track, and you're saying, no, not for me, I'm doing this.
Yeah.
There's a lot of courage involved there.
And I guess that night we won.
Yeah, that's good.
And I thought, well, okay, this works.
Yeah, okay, good.
So I thought I need to do more now. And that's when I actually joined the party. And I remember my dad dropped me off at the local community centre and he said, son, this is not going to be a very exciting meeting, I tell you that, no. But he said, this is the first opportunity for something bigger.
Yeah.
And I went, thanks, Dad. And I walked in and he was right, it was pretty boring. But I felt proud about joining a club.
Yeah, no, it's cool.
You know?
How old were you then?
17.
Yeah, that's good. Good age.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, it's, of course, how should I say, Scottish tradition is not exactly anti-labor, is it?
No.
I mean, it's been a stronghold for so long. No, I at one point I was assigned to lead the grape boycott, organize a grape boycott, which in the farm markets we were using to force the growers to sign with us in Canada. And it turns out Toronto was the third largest grape market in North America, and Montreal was the fifth. And so that's when I met my first Clydesider. And the whole elevator constructors union were all from there. And the spirit was just great. Even though the language was a little hard for me sometimes, but no, it was a wonderful education in Canada. The other thing was that it was so like America, but so different in fundamental ways. The labor movement there was very different. The Labor Party, there was a Labor Party. It was really significant, New Democratic Party. It just opened my eyes to sort of what politics and labor could be. And the fact it's so like the United States, the differences are really important. Yeah, that was an important part of my political education. Yeah, really grateful for it.
Oh, and my father is from Glasgow. He grew up on the Red Clyde,
Yeah, well, there you go.
And just sort of, you're talking about narrative and it being an instruction.
Yeah.
I spent most nights after dinner, Dad and I would sit there and chat for
Well,
an hour and a half.
Yeah.
And it was all just stories.
Yeah.
And I'm just absorbing
Yeah.
and just asking questions. And Dad,
Yeah.
I don't know whether it was true or not, but he was a great storyteller.
Yeah.
And when I think about the sort of the political socialisation of who I was, it really is just from those dinner conversations. Not less so reading papers and things, but actually just sitting down and talking to my father.
No, it's great. Yeah, he did a good job.
Yeah, you did. I want to ask you about. I find really interesting the point you were talking before about the faith-based narrative, and it comes through strongly for those of you that have done the LOA course, and anyone wishing to do it, you should do it with Marshall. It's throughout it, like Rabbi Hillel. You talked about Moses and been a bit of a hero of yours, an insider, outsider. There's references to Catholic text as well. Obviously, I grew up in the Catholic faith. The experiences that you had in Mississippi, as well as I'd imagine with the farm workers as well.
Oh yeah, Mass, at least once a week. But it was, I learned what it meant, the celebration, and that's the word of the Mass, of the Eucharist, as this profound moment of solidarity and transcendence. And at one point it was my job to prepare priests who were coming to say Mass with our community, that we wanted general absolution so everyone could participate, that we wanted the kiss of peace to take as long as was necessary, to open up intentions. In other words, it became and was a way of celebrating the movement, and not just like a theological event, but a really profound event to be shared by everyone. And yeah, those traditions were really central to both movements, and and it made sense to me in a way. The question is, where do we find our moral center? Who are we to each other? Where do we get hope? What does it mean to be part of a community? I mean, faith traditions, for all their limitations, are about that. And they're not about dealing with the latest nuclear issue. They're about dealing with human issues. And, the struggle to find hope, to overcome obstacles, to recognize kinship. It has always been an important source of learning and growth and development. And so one of the questions today is like, well, so where is that? How do we get that grounding? And I know it's not like, oh, everybody's going to become religious. Of course, there's a lot of people who say, I was raised as, which means I'm not anymore, except you really may be. So in a place like this university, you're not supposed to talk about it. Oh no, we don't talk about that. And so with intentionality, creating a space where, hey, talk about what moves you, why you care. So I think it's part of a real moral dilemma we're in. What's our foundation? What's our grounding? I know in this country, it's really a mess.
I've discussed this with other people on the podcast before, particularly being someone from a faith-based background. The Labor Party is a secular party.
Sure,
and that's great.
Yeah,
so it should be. But it's to the point that all of a sudden I feel, and bizarrely enough, the Labor Party kind of was founded by the Irish Catholic working class. But anyway, leaving that to one side, I kind of feel like an outsider in that respect because I don't want to talk about my faith, but sometimes I think that my faith is central to who I am. I make the argument that Jesus Christ is probably one of the most effective community organisers, probably rivaled by Moses and maybe the Prophet Muhammad as well. But you know what I mean? Like,
I know exactly what you mean.
Yeah. But one of the things I do find interesting from studying some of these campaigns is that I guess the takeaway for me is that these cultural norms are important to grounding those campaigns, right? So whether it be faith-based or something else, song or dance or
Yes,
chants. I
yes.
mean, Colour of Change talk about, black joy.
Yeah.
We need to do more of that. I think it's too much sort of hard-nosed kind of let's just win this thing and not enough sort of heart.
It turns us into instruments. The heart foundation. It's just, we're supposed to we're supposed to be these cognitive instrumental creatures, and if we behave that way, like in the economic models and all that, it's sociopathic because it negates all the emotional language we speak with one another about caring, about compassion, about courage, about risk, all of that. And so we need a language through which to talk about it, not so much in words, but through shared experience. And that's why we teach narrative the way we do. It's rooted in experience. It's how do I communicate experientially what I'm called to or what we share. Now, faith communities speak the language of emotion that way. And any movement speaks the language of emotion. And so it's finding that kind of grounding. And when you pretend that, it's all just like, what's my interest? What's your interest? Interests I think of as being more strategic questions. Values are a much deeper question. Celine, our friend, she described growing up in France as, in her growing up, she had some pretty tough time at home. And she learned that she really had to stand up to oppression, to what she experienced as oppression. Developed a real value around that. Now, it had nothing to do with Palestine. Years later, that's how that value became embodied for her. And that became then an issue and an interest. And so I think we get these things confused because the first one's all about the heart. And it's also where we can make the most connection with each other because they tend to be pretty basic things. Then how we focus that is the second question. And when we try to just organize around the issue and not why we care about the issue, then it's too narrow. And in this country, it's just been the fragmentation of issue is a strategic choice. It's not an identity, but it begins to play that role, and that's fed by the donorocracy. That you have to show you're different from that one to get your funding, and everybody depends on that funding, and so it becomes it just builds fragmentation into it. So coming back to the communication of the heart, of why we care, who we are, that's so fundamental. It's so important. And there's a lot of resistance to it. It's as if emotion, oh no, that's going to take over, But you ignore emotion, you're just ceding the territory to the bad guys because they don't have an issue. And it's a big difference to mobilize out of hate, out of fear rather, than out of hope. And they do very well with fear. And we got to do better with hope.
I'm going to come back to that at the end, actually. But before we do, I want to ask you a question about Cesar Chavez and his leadership.
Yeah.
I hadn't considered until I did the Leadership Organising and Action course that a lens of organising through the role of leadership.
Yeah.
Talk to us about Cesar's leadership in the work that he did with United Farm Workers.
Well, he was trained in organizing for 10 years before he ever started with the farm workers. He was recruited by, it was an organization called the Community Service Organization in California. It became the first real Mexican-American civic organization, and it was organized by a guy named Fred Ross, who'd been hired by Saul Alinsky back in Chicago to do this. So he connected with Cesar. Cesar worked with him. He found Cesar was working in a lumber mill at the time in San Jose. And because he'd grown up, the family had a farm near Yuma, Arizona, close to the border with Mexico. But then they lost that in the Depression, so then they became a migrant family, and so they were moving all over the place. Finally, they sort of settled in Delano. He was in the Navy then, came back, and he went through a period of being I don't know if you know the word pachuco. It's like, or zoot suits. It's like the street culture that of the generation struggling with, am I Mexican? Am I American? What am I? A lot of immigrant communities have versions of this, but he was a very curious guy, and the priest actually in San Jose turned him on to the lives of the saints and Gandhi, and he saw something in him. And so then when Fred Ross came to town, he said, "Oh, go talk to this guy." So for 10 years he was learning organizing and building this statewide organization that got pensions for non-citizens. I mean, it was a lot of really strong civic voting action stuff. But he wanted then to take on the thing he'd grown up with, the farm worker thing, and they were not interested. It was more urban and what was called middle class, but that meant like having a construction job. So he made a commitment to do this and went off and refused any outside money. For 3 years, he had 8 kids, and it was not an easy go, but it was like learning how to do this. And at first, they said, okay, because he had others working with him, okay, we're a farm workers association. What are we going to do? Well, death benefit, that was something, because they didn't have the cohesion to take on the employers yet. And his analysis was that people had tried to strike and organize at the same time, and it didn't work because the cohesion wasn't there. So they built like this death benefit, credit union, those kinds of things. But the first elected board were all volunteers. That was the old model. And no, I'm going to be the organizer. Well, yeah, except building the union was not the whole life calling of the guy who was elected president. It was a nice guy. They weren't going to drive it. So then they changed their constitution and they decided to have elected officers, but at least one would be full-time. And so that was a different model than had been the traditional community. So that became Cesar's role. And so then and they built a board and so forth. Now, when the strike came, he'd been earning $50 a month. When the strike came, there was no money. And so then it became, now we really need to turn into a movement. The civil rights movement was happening all around. There was support for people, oppressed minorities struggling to exercise their voice. More support in the U.S. than there was for labor stuff. It's very interesting. In the 1930s, when farm workers turned white for a period of time, and Steinbeck and everybody wrote, it was like more class solidarity. After the Second World War, it was more civil rights kind of solidarity that was able to become a base of support. So he was very gifted in connecting people, building a team, a really terrific team, in constant learning. He read Gandhi's autobiography, The Story of My Experiments with Truth. Everything's a hypothesis, and you're learning. You don't make assumptions. You have hypotheses about things. When I met him, he was reading Churchill because he wanted to understand Gandhi's opponent, and so he would read books as manuals and just draw a lesson from that. So he was a real autodidact in that way, an experimenter. So he had a wonderful gift for cultural blending, because we've got the Catholic thing, and then we have the Mexican culture, and then we have the civil rights movement, and but finding the blend, not a forced like, wear a collar so they'll know you, but it was really well grounded, and he had a real gift for that, and strategy. He's really creative strategically. In a way, it's an extension of street smarts. You learn how to do a lot with a little. That's basically what strategy is. How do you do a lot with a little? And so it was good preparation. And so there was a lot of learning, constant learning. And that was so strong. So for many years, his leadership was just terrific. But then it ran into trouble. And it's kind of becomes a tragic story. After all these successes, getting legislation, building a real union of agricultural workers, first time, at a certain point, it was as if his inner sense of confidence broke something. Rod Kramer, who teaches at Stanford, wrote a piece called Political Paranoia, and he described the plight of, he's just talking about Lyndon Johnson. You become more and more powerful within the setting. Everybody starts telling you what they think you want to hear. And you kind of know that you're being cut off. And so you begin to feel this isolation that goes with that. And people are scared, whatever it might be. If it's a charismatic role, then you have to somehow live up to this image of you that you know is not you. And that creates all kinds of tensions. And it's sort of your observations of people, which has been very strength for you, become sinister. Three people talking across the room would have been, oh, that's interesting. But then it becomes, what are they doing? What are they talking about? And that happened to him. And it happened gradually at first, and it was so hard for us to accept. And, because he'd always been, quirky, and that was cool. But so you put up with a lot of weird stuff. And because we were doing so great out in the field, out in the organizing, we were really, kicking ass, as they say. And, but it got worse. And it kept getting worse. We lost an election, a ballot initiative campaign in California that seemed to be a real kind of breaking point. And so it turned inside, and then purges began. And then, people were agents, and it just kept getting worse. And then the real clincher was he was so frustrated. You could see that because things were not working, and he encountered Chuck Dietrich. Now, Dietrich was the leader of something called Synanon. And Synanon was a drug treatment program in LA in the 60s. So it was a very good program. And it centered around a practice called the game. And the game was that once a week you would sit in a circle with everybody. There'd be a game master. And then the deal was you would indict somebody for screwing up. Now, it could be true or not true. And then everybody would join in, and then you had to figure out how to move it to somebody else. Well, if you're in the middle of a therapeutic process in which, tearing down to build up, you can see that. And one of the founders of Synanon went up to San Francisco, John Maher, who always claimed to be with the IRA, and he formed an alliance with a woman named Mimi Silver. They created something called Delancey Street, one of the best programs for ex-cons and addicts. I mean, in San Francisco, they became a real power, and in a terrific way. But Dietrich, on his own, turned it into a cult, and it became a religion. But everything worked. The trains ran on time. Everything worked. Well, yeah, I mean, people gave up their money. He told them who to sleep with and all that. So right at the peak of our success, Cesar calls us to a meeting at their headquarters in the Sierras, and everybody's walking around with shaved heads. Everybody's really nice, and And so this was going to be what's going to save us. And so then the game was introduced, and we had to learn to play the game. Well, some of us just wouldn't do it. And it's interesting, the religious were the most resistant to this thing, to their credit. But it became a thing. And at one point, we were traveling on Saturday from all over the state to play the game at the union headquarters and go back. Well, that was really destructive. And it was so destructive, it then led to this polarizing within the union of like Cesar trying to build this, whatever it was, and the rest of us trying to build a union, a good one. And there was a board meeting in 1978, an issue about the payment, and the board split 5-4. And I was among the younger then. I was on the board. And Eliseo Medina was there, who later became the National Secretary and Treasurer of SEIU. And my partner, Jessica, and Mac Lyons, who was African-American. We voted to build the union. And the 5 voted, Cesar threatened to resign. And so, and it was a generational gap. And after that, it was really problematic. And so then it was more a question of how long to stay. And I stayed till 81 because we'd won a big strike in 1979. I wanted to, you're working with people. You want to realize the good, but it became impossible. And so eventually workers from somebody decided they would try to run people for the board. Well, they got run out of the convention. They got fired from their jobs. It was just devastating.
And
I think, well, just one other thing. See, I think one of the mistakes we made, we didn't create local unions. Now, what that meant was workers elected their committee at the ranch level, and it was good. It was a working deal. And then there was the board elected. There was nothing in between. And the fact there was nothing in between, there was no domain of power consolidation strong enough to challenge the national and also to bring coherence to the locals. That was missing. And we were set out to do it in 73. We lost all our contracts that year, and so it didn't happen. And I think that could have, look, there's a lot of different things, but I think we allowed power to become just way too concentrated at the top, and then one ranch was never strong enough to challenge it. So there is some structural stuff to it, but it's also, we learn. Accountability, I think, is so fundamental. Moral accountability, political accountability, economic accountability, and once we lose accountability, I think we're on a slide, and that's what happened with he stopped being accountable. He didn't need to be accountable anymore.
It's something that I've noticed that can be a problem with the trade union movement in Australia is that, and you speak about it in the program, that leadership island that you create that is separate from your constituency.
Yeah.
I'm not suggesting that's a widespread problem in the trade union movement, but sometimes you can start to see it creep in, and when there are problems, it normally is that they are disconnected from the people that they're actually there to represent and organise.
Yeah, no, it's, but you see it in a lot of, Kramer's piece should be much more widely read because I think he really does capture something. It isn't just that this person was mentally ill. It's like there are conditions that facilitate, and that lack of accountability, that disconnect is a real problem. And so it's a challenge to democracy. How do you then create a functional democracy where it actually does hold people who hold power accountable? And the problem often is that the incumbents then control the whole machinery. And so then, to mount a challenge is very difficult. Now, I'm not sure how the scene works in Australia in internal union governance. It's been a real problem here. And, so then there's some sort of, we have to have direct democracy. Well, but that doesn't really work, not at scale. And it's also, there's no then consolidation and no learning from having to come up with a common perspective. But then how to retain the accountability mechanism, I think, is a real core challenge.
So you returned to Harvard to
Yeah.
finish your undergrad, and then you,
Yeah.
and then congratulations,
Yeah,
and then
thank you.
and then continue on with a postgrad. Talk me through the process in which you then developed the framework that you now teach today, and all of us are sort of trying to help
Yeah, I think
grow.
no, I think it basically it comes from organizing. I mean, it comes from training worker leadership, because it had to be experiential, and it had to be accessible, and it had to be how can I put it? Accessible without being simple, or simple without being simple-minded. It had to be accessible, and we were doing that all the time. That's how we would win elections, to develop a committee. So I got a real grounding in that, and that was sort of one of the things I did well, was leadership development. So coming back to school and then being asked to develop a course here on organizing, because the year before, my wife and I had organized the mid-career class to challenge the school on curriculum and on quality of teaching.
Love
and all
it.
that. Yeah, I mean, that was because we both did this mid-career master's program together. So then when I was accepted into the PhD program, the academic dean at the time here said, hey, why don't you come and teach organizing here? You know, they say better to have them
In the tent.
inside. Yeah, right, exactly. And but it turned out for me to be a real gift, because it was a way that I could integrate my life experience and all those years of leadership development training with the social science I was learning, which was really valuable stuff, a perspective on my experience that was different, and that was a real learning thing. How could I combine those in a pedagogy? Really, again, I've always thought of it as I go to class twice a week and I have a chance to have a conversation with the future. That's pretty cool. And so, because I knew if I was going to teach organizing here, it wasn't going to be about the theory of organizing, it was going to be organizing. So how do you do that? Well, you have to make it experiential. So you have to figure out how to use the classroom as a venue within which you can launch people into learning to ride bicycles rather than just theorize about them. And so that's kind of how it evolved. And then as I was working on my PhD, every year I would teach a class here, and they grew, and it got more complex, and I started developing teaching fellows, which then became modeling leadership development, and it evolved out of that. These core practices were, they were like basic organizing. I mean, you build relationships, it's fundamental. You tell stories, you have to strategize. So it evolved from that. But and what I was trying to do was align pedagogy with practice. In other words, we're now going to learn about relationships by hearing a lecture on well, no, you're going to build relationships, and you're going to debrief that, and that's how you're going to learn. And so that's sort of and it kept evolving. We're learning every year. And then as it began to move into other domains, other countries, the learning just accelerated. I mean, it was like, whoa, this happens to work in Jordan and in Tokyo. Ooh, that's interesting. What do we learn from that? So, and that's what keeps it alive for me now, is, we're always learning new stuff.
I've never known how that you came into contact and connection with the Obama campaign.
It was interesting because in 2003, Howard Dean was running, and a friend and former organizing colleague, Karen Hicks, was the campaign manager in New Hampshire. That was pretty important. And they had a terrific core of young people who were very talented. They were very attracted. When I quizzed them about it, it was kind of like integrity and courage was what they liked about Dean. It wasn't so much the specific policy, but he said the emperor has no clothes, and he had the guts to do that. And so, but they were just all being used to do voter ID. a year before the election. It was waste. And she saw it and they saw it. And so she said, why don't we teach them organizing? I said, oh, okay, that sounds cool. So I went up to New Hampshire, and I just remember this one day, it was in a yurt, and it was really hot. And but we were taking people through the basics, and they were really responding to it, because then they became agents. They weren't just drones out there, just, identifying voters like canvassing does. They then could become creators. They could become organizers. And it really took off. And one of my teaching fellows, Jeremy Bird, connected him to that campaign. One named Buffy. It was like a core place where we were learning together how to do this now. I got someone who was a great teacher of house meetings from the farm workers to come and train them in house meetings. But it wasn't bullshit house meetings. It was like count everything. It was like really disciplined. And so a house meeting campaign then produced an organization, first on the county level and then on the state level. And it was terrific organization. It didn't overcome the scream, which was itself a fake thing. I mean, it was just, and so Kerry won, but we turned New Hampshire blue for the first time, building that really rich infrastructure. So that was kind of a very important learning experience. In our core team, it was Jeremy, who later became field director for Obama's second campaign and was key in the first. Robbie Mook, who should have learned more. He was our numbers guy. He turned out to be Hillary's campaign manager. But it was one of those, I don't know if you've noticed that there tend to be these clusters at particular moments where people learn a bunch of stuff and then they go out into different domains. And it was that kind of thing in New Hampshire. So when it came to Obama, it was like, because we heard the convention speech that year in 2004
in this city.
Yeah, that's right. And in fact, we were here also at the same time because the folks that ran New Hampshire were asked to run the national field program for Kerry with no resources and and everybody's brother-in-law being contracted out to and all that stuff. So yeah, we were here in Boston, and it really kind of clicked. And so when he decided he was going to run, a bunch of the people who'd been involved, Jeremy, Buffy, Hauser, wanted to, this could be the real deal. So we sort of worked our way into it. Jeremy became director in South Carolina. Buffy was in the West Coast. And we were trying to turn the campaign toward organizing. Now, they knew at the top that they had to win close elections. So that gives you an edge. They didn't have a theory of organizing, none. I mean, it's just a myth that Obama, it just, so the four key states, somebody different was in charge of each state. They all took different approaches. There was no learning. There was nothing. It was like, okay, Iowa, that's caucuses. We put the guy that knows how to organize caucuses there because it's organizing. You have to organize. In New Hampshire, they hired a hack, basically, from the Bradley campaign, and it was an awful campaign. It was like just pure mobilizing. I mean, the field director went around with a bat. It was awful, and we kept going up to New Hampshire. And I remember we had a meeting with Prof where we were saying, look, this is a disaster, and they didn't do anything. South Carolina, Jeremy wound up being the field director there. So then, now, and the other thing going on was that that in California, there was all this support for Obama, a lot of funding, but they weren't seeing anything. So the guy who was the field director at the time, Cuauhtemoc Figueroa, who we knew was from the public sector union, but he reached out and said, what could we do to respond? And so then Buffy Wicks, who's now in the legislature in California, she was in charge of the Western U.S. So she was really sold, we have to engage people. That led to the first Camp Obama in L.A., in Burbank, where we pulled together what we knew from working with the Sierra Club, from the classes, into that framework of these practices and tried it out in this 2.5-day deal. Well, it really clicked. I mean, the team structure that hadn't been used before, the public narrative, people would come and say, I want to learn Obama's narrative. We said, no, yours, because that's what people want to know. Why are you supporting? Not like why Obama should be elected. He's very good at that. You don't need to do that. And so it was a real kind of culture shift. And the Camp Obamas became much more like culture events, culture forging, or like the church would say formation events, rather than just like, here, learn this skill. They were cultural in that context. And so all that kind of converged. And it converged particularly when they won Iowa, which was an organizing win. And just incidentally, I mean, South Carolina, the black community was hesitant. It was after Iowa that they began to think, oh, this guy could really win. They thought it was either they'll kill him or there's no way he can win. That shifted after that. New Hampshire, we went up for the election. He lost. I was happy because it made the point, like they screwed up there. And so that led to the Yes We Can, which was the translation of Si Se Puede for the farm workers at that speech that night in New Hampshire. And then we win South Carolina, House meetings, organizing. Yes, perfect. And so after that, the campaign was in tribes. There was the Iowa tribe, the New Hampshire tribe, and the South Carolina tribe. And so after that, the New Hampshire people were all sent to re-education camps, you might say, and had to be reculturated into the thing. And then eventually that whole approach, the organizing approach, became the dominant approach. And it was like in the middle of, it was in 2008 when they were bringing on all these summer people. What are we going to do? How are we going to do it? There was a fight, and we won that. And so that's how it happened. Now, it aligned with Obama's rhetoric, but that whole organizing approach did not come from the top. And it was people like Jeremy and Buffy and others who made the thing happen.
I often wonder, when I watch the Susan Christopher video.
Yeah, she's amazing.
And her story of us. And I've been meaning to ask you this, because I think you sort of come in at the end before it gets cut. Did you realise at that moment, wow, we might be onto something here?
Oh, it was an incredible moment. I mean, that was on the second day. And when she did that, no, it just electrified the room. I mean, people were literally like standing up and applauding for 5 minutes or something, because she nailed it. And, sometimes those things happen and you have a camera. Often you don't.
Yeah.
But there was a guy who wasn't official. He was doing video stuff on his own to support the campaign. And he captured all that.
Yeah.
And so we said, oh, this is really cool. The story of us, what it means, it's evolved a lot on how to teach it, how to describe it, how to understand it. But she made it happen. She really made it happen right there. And it's one of those deals where you just say, oh, my God, look at this.
And there's something that I think about in terms of the impact of your work and then the impact of the work of others that you brought in together isn't just felt here in the United States, but it's felt everywhere. And I can only speak about the Australian experience because you and I were talking off mic before. After, in 2013 or 2010's election in Australia, I'm standing over an envelope folding machine at 2 a.m. in a campaign office with a friend of mine, and this is meant to be a mail out to go out to, tens of thousands of voters. And I'm just thinking, no one's going to read this. Why am I here at 2 a.m.? I'm exhausted. This is stupid. And I'd already been volunteer on the Obama campaign in 2008, and I've seen organising, and my background I was a union organiser.
Yeah.
And at that moment I went, no, if I get the opportunity to try and do something different, then I'm going to do that.
Yeah.
And it was the Obama campaign that at that moment, I tried to harness as much as I possibly could.
Yeah.
I didn't know about you though.
Yeah.
I knew about Obama, but it was only when I started to scratch deeper, and I went,
Yeah.
oh no, it's not the Obama one. It's actually this bloke called Marshall Ganz, and he's a lecturer at Harvard University, and then started reading and YouTubing and all that kind of stuff. Then I realised, that became my dedication for the next 6 years.
Wow. It's so, I just have a lot of gratitude because, that's what we were hoping. And I think, when we introduced that framework, it was like we developed it in a project with the Sierra Club, but also in the classes here. And then when we introduced it, well, even before that, one of the strengths of the Kennedy School, and believe me, there's a lot of non-strengths, but one of the strengths is the international character of it. And so you're teaching a class that is people from many parts of the world. It's even more now like that. That's really cool because you kind of have to learn what cuts across and what doesn't. And so it makes it a very rich kind of learning context. Of course, here nobody was teaching practice, and so that was kind of like a separate thing. But the Obama then really put this kind of on the map. And it's interesting because Peja Stojicic, whom you may know from Serbia, he and three of his friends had come to volunteer in the Obama campaign here. And they had to explain why from Serbia do you want Obama to win. But he went back, and then he saw the campaign materials. And then we did that was when we first did our distance learning. And it was our first experiment with that. And that's when we realized, oh, this is international. This, and so Peja was right there, and they were doing something called Serbia on the Move, and that became something there. And then Nisreen Hashahmad, who was a mid-career here, went back to Jordan and started doing Ahel there. Kanoko Kamata, who was a mid-career here, goes back to Japan and starts doing that there. What was interesting about it was that the growth was not because we strategically targeted Japan, but because there was someone who wanted to step up and lead and make it happen. And same thing with Nisreen, same thing with Peja, and same thing with others. And so it really wound up being a leadership development strategy where cascaded leadership was how the thing could grow. And so then, now every year, between online and offline, I'm working between 400 and 500 students every year, and they're from everywhere.
Amazing.
They're from everywhere, and then of course out there, then they're doing. Nisreen's this is her third year of teaching organizing online in Arabic, and reaches people in 11 countries. They had 95 slots. They had 600 applications. So it's that kind of a growth thing. Obama really put it on the map, but it's people who've stepped up and seen this as something they want to build. Is kind of how it's been growing.
That's a good point as well, because now, as you say that, there are I think there are about 150 field organisers that have gone through the Victorian Labor Community Action Network program.
Yeah.
In fact, we have a red hoodie that says Organiser on the front.
Okay, good.
And you only get one if you're an organiser.
Okay, that's really good.
And you only get it after 10 weeks, and they actually have a presentation where they call people's names up and they present them with a hoodie. And in fact, if you lift up the hood, there's a number behind it, and it says you what number you are in order of organisers.
Very cool. That's really cool.
It's one of our moments of heart, which is few and far between, I think, in Australian organising.
I'd love to see a picture of that, though.
I'll definitely send you one.
Maybe get a hoodie, but it would have to be extra large.
Indeed. And and from that 150 organisers, there's over 10,000 volunteers and volunteer leaders have gone through that program. Yeah. A lot of them there is no direct engagement with Barack Obama. They're not motivated to get involved in this campaign because of Barack Obama. But the thing that unites us all isn't Barack Obama. The thing that unites us all is organising, and a commitment to creating change, which I think is really, really special.
Yeah, it is really special.
One thing that we've found, and I'm interested to get your thoughts on this, in the early days of us embracing this model, we received a lot of pushback at the grassroots level from either politicians, incumbent politicians who we're trying to get elected, candidates who are trying to get elected, but even rank and file branch members of the Labor Party were like, we don't. This American mumbo jumbo is not going to work here.
Right.
That might work, in the inner city of Melbourne, but it's not going to work in the suburbs or in the country, right? At one stage, someone actually yelled at one of our organisers, "When are you Americans going to learn this shit's never going to work here?" Horrific, right?
I know.
I know. Now, I think I try to work out how we overcome those challenges, but I'm interested in getting a sense from you about how you have tried to overcome those challenges, because surely you've received pushback as well.
No, it's in this. Start with the Kennedy School being freaked out that people might cry in class. Jesus, we can't have that. But we had ground, and we're building it. But the first place outside the U.S. where we really dove into taking this whole approach was really with the NHS in the UK. And it was a project that came, we were introduced to the whole world of health through Don Berwick, who was a great figure here, ran something called the Institute for Healthcare Improvement. He would have an annual gathering of 5,000 people, medical students and providers and the whole thing. And he asked me to go do a thing on organizing after Obama. And so Helen Bevan, who ran the innovation section for the NHS, was there and said, "Oh, this is cool. We want to try this." So we put together a team, and so we had 2.5 years. But at the first sessions, that American stuff, that talking about yourself, Brits don't do that, and stiff upper lip, and just, okay. And that was true for about 10 minutes. Creating an authorizing environment, or what we call a brave space, not just a safe space, helped create a context in which people would risk it. And once they risked it, the benefits were huge, because they were connecting with each other in ways they just hadn't, and seeing each other in ways they hadn't seen each other. And so it sort of then, in a sense, kind of proved itself. But that was the first time in Jordan. No, Arabs, no way. Arab men, are you kidding? And I love this story because, and of course all the instruction was in Arabic. But there was a guy who was a climate activist, and he was working on environment stuff. And he said, "I don't have a story. I have no story." Okay. So came back the next day. "I found my story." "Okay, well, what's your story?" He said, "Well, he grew up in a village where his father had olive trees, and the olive trees were they were the love of his life. And in the Quran, in combat, you have to spare innocence and trees, because trees are a life source." And then one day, the bulldozers came, and they tore out the trees, and his father fell on. He said, "My father fell on his back. I saw tears come from his eyes, and I realized at that moment I had to save the trees." Okay, that's pretty good.
Yeah.
And so and I think Samar Dudeen really gets this. She was one of the collaborators with Nisreen in Jordan. She said, "Oh, I see. This is not a blueprint, it's a roadmap." It's like not saying, "Here's a formula, apply it." It's look within your own identity and culture for those sources of hope and solidarity and all that, and and you'll find it, but you look for it. And I think she put it so well of what we've been trying to do is not be a blueprint, but introduce a roadmap that people can use in a lot of different ways. Japan, they said, "No way in Japan." People are not going to talk about themselves. When we created the authorizing, the environment, the context, it was really cool. People said things like, nobody ever asked me what I thought. Nobody ever asked me. And it was like, whoa, I am here and somebody and with others, and very powerful stuff. And that workshop in Tokyo turned out to be one of the best, because it like released this energy that gets suppressed and bottled and so forth. So that's kind of been our experience. And when people say, oh, this American stuff, it'll never work here, I say, okay, let's just try it. And it turns out it's not American stuff, it's human stuff.
Exactly. I just pointed you there before when you said, no one's ever asked me before. That came back to us in waves once we really got going.
Yeah.
People, 65% of the volunteers in our grassroots movement are not even members of the Labor Party.
Yeah.
They voted Labor all their life, but
Yeah.
they had no way of knowing how to get involved.
Yeah.
And then when they got involved
Yeah.
and someone sat down and said, well,
Yeah.
what's your story?
Yeah, yeah.
They were like, oh. And they had to sit and think
Yeah.
about it. And when they shared it,
It's really powerful.
other people, and you just walk out of those rooms going, this is
Yeah.
amazing,
Yeah, yeah.
What about relationship building in as a practice to overcome some of those barriers as well?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think then there's the story work, but then that informs the relationship building as intentional. And it's kind of like, it takes a bit of a frame, because you think of relationship building as friendly and all that. Well, this is a little different. This is about intentional relationship building that's based more on respect than liking. And that's sometimes a challenging thing, but unless you get to those kinds of relationships, you never get to citizenship. I mean, what does it mean to be a member of a political community that's rooted in relationships with one another? Because it's not just connection to the idea, it's connection to the other people. That's where the strength is, and that's where the commitments are. So what is it that connects us? Well, it may be that, we grew up in the same place, but it may also be that we share a commitment to a common purpose, common set of values, and base relationships on that rather than on kinship, or and then you begin building something that's very strong because it is in those terms of those values, if this makes sense. This made, that I know of, the first person that got this was a guy named Cleisthenes in 6th century BC Athens, because they were trying to establish a regime of equality before the law, of course, for those eligible, which were white free men. But and they had trouble because the participation in the polis, in the city, was based on tribe. And the tribes were traditional tribes with lots of hierarchy. And so it was like this conflict. And so what they did, they reorganized the tribes. They created civic tribes with democratic structures, not the same traditional hierarchy. And so your participation in the polis was mediated by your membership in a civic tribe. Now, so that's citizenship. That's what that means. And so they had to find a way, because kinship, you know where that goes. Nepotism. It's not the basis for anything that ever can be an equal society. So to me, that's kind of the relational challenge. Is what is it that then connects us? If it's not ethnicity, if it's not this, not that, that allows us to draw the riches of that diversity into a common purpose. And that's kind of what I see as the relational work. But then people learn how to do that, and one-on-one meetings and house meetings, and it's all about building relational infrastructure. One of the things I think people misunderstand is that commitment in a movement is to an idea. No, it's commitment to the other people. It's horizontal. That's where the power is. And so facilitating the horizontal relationships, that's really where because, they say, people fight for their buddies, and, not for the big cause. There's a lot of truth in that. And so it's commitments you make to each other is where the real stability is.
I've just checked the time, and if this was a basketball game, it would have been triple overtime. So I'm conscious of wrapping up. And I want to ask you a final question, Marshall. You touched on it earlier about where we are in this world right now,
Yeah.
politically, socially, culturally.
Yeah.
The rise of far right politics has really tested the guardrails of liberal democracies.
No kidding.
And I always get asked a question a lot by folks. Can the right organise? And I think we've probably seen that.
Yeah. How about that?
Yeah, yeah, they can. If they would it be? I think it's fair to say that they're organising around the concept of fear, whereas we're organising around the concept of hope, love, solidarity.
That's exactly.
How are we going to win that one?
Well, okay, good question. Because in a way, what's created the constituency for them has been 40 years of neoliberal stuff, of ignoring the needs of ordinary people, elitist politics on both here in both parties, and chickens come home to roost sometime. And Thomas Piketty, in his second book, Capital and Ideology, is really good. He really kind of nails this. He talks about the Brahmin left. Education is the thing. And so here we are in this. And then the egalitarian's gone. And so then where do people go? Hey, come over here. Here's some identity. Here's nationalism. Here's whatever. And this is a time-honored response to fascist movements, is you offer identity in replace of equality. And if the so-called left is not offering equality, then you got a real problem. And, that's a structural kind of thing that is in a lot of different countries, not just here. You add to that, then in our country, the monetization of politics. Now, I'm sure money matters, but it's a whole different game. Here we've created it's a multi-billion-dollar industry of political advertising. And so, you want to run for Congress? Okay, raise your first $3 million, and then we'll take you seriously. And this goes back to a Supreme Court decision, Buckley v. Vallejo in 1972, that said money is speech. So therefore, you cannot constrain campaign spending. It's not where it comes from. It's the fact that it's infinite. And so that's a business. And so then the more money you spend, the more money you make. And that's kind of, so we're the only liberal democracy, so-called, that has that. That's a real problem. And then there's the challenge of all these ways in which we get commodified, through the whole market system. Everything's individualized. Here, that's a big, big problem. And so collectivity becomes suspect, and structure even becomes suspect. So there's a lot of catch-up to do. And it's so frustrating that there they are building their movement, and it is a movement. I mean, they're right. It's a movement. By any measure, their people are highly committed because they're getting value of being somebody in that context. And the politics are experiential. There's this historian of France who wrote a book called The Anatomy of Fascism. It's really, really good. It's the first thing I read after Trump was elected. And he points out that right-wing politics are not ideological as they are experiential, or fascism. Now, conservative politics, ideology, like our friend in the UK right now, my God, what a deal. But what attracts people to fascism is the experience of oneness, of being part of identifying with an avatar, a hero, that you can then live through. Every time Trump insults somebody, they cheer because they like to do it, but they don't have the power, and they feel powerless, and so they get power in this way. So and it's based then on fear. It's based on diminishment of agency, but it's real, and it's speaking the language of emotion. Now over here, let's talk about policy. Let's talk about the plan to do X, Y, Z. We'll give them this benefit, and that will do everything, but no respect, and it's a problem, and so then you wonder. Here there was mobilizing going on to, to fight authoritarianism. So, okay, great. How about organizing to make democracy real? It's reactive. It's got to be proactive. What does democracy mean in people's everyday lives? After World War II, people had an idea what it meant. What does it mean now? How does that play out in terms of how we work with one another? The union movement is much stronger in Australia. Here, the experience people have from day to day of governing themselves collectively, it's very rare. NGOs don't do that. They're like nonprofit firms. It's the same deal. And so so citizenship in an organization, like citizenship in a country, the experience of self-governance is really critical. And that's one of the things that I'm really focusing on here, because so many of the movements of young people, especially, there's a lot of energy there, but they fear structure. And there's a number of reasons. I mean, we did too in my generation. But what it does is it creates all this mobilizing, all this energy, but it's not building anything because there's no organizational vision. And I think this makes sense because in the farm workers, we knew we were building a union, okay? And so we'd win campaigns, lose campaigns, but we were building this vehicle for power ourselves. And you don't get that in a lot of these movements that are just all about mobilizing. So reintroducing a vision of democratic organization seems really important. And that's one of the projects that I'm really involved in here, working with Sunrise and others to try to kind of revitalize what it really means to what democracy as a form of governance really means in terms of our lived experience and who we are to each other. It's challenging. For me, I look then to where the sources of energy are. And now there's some new energy around workplace organizing here. Now the question is, will the unions take advantage of that or not? But it's there, tight labor market. People become conscious of their power in a tight labor market. There's that. Youth, all around climate, that's a huge thing. A lot of energy there, all over the world. How is it turned into a source of power? That's the question. The global women's movement is really something amazing, because you talk about a traditional form of authority that's been around for a long time. That's being challenged, and it's one of the reasons I think for the misogyny. It's a fearful reaction. It's kind of like you took away race as my source of superiority. Then you're taking away my guns, and then you're taking away my women, and it's like, whoa. And so there's just a fearful reaction, but boy, is it a powerful source of energy. I see in my classes 2/3 of women, and all over the world this is happening. So there are real sources of energy. So then how to give that organizational form so it becomes a real source of power, I think, is what our challenge is. And we're in a lot of trouble here in this country. I think you have a lot more going for you. In Australia, a strong labor movement's really important. And and the practice of self-government, everybody has to vote there. Now, whether that's, a mixed blessing or whatever, but, not here. And yeah, so I guess it feels to me like we're in a moment in which nobody's got the answer. But what we have to do is get on pathways to find answers, to go as learners, not as knowers. Not like, hey, I got it all figured out, just here's my blueprint for the future. Just, it doesn't work that way. And Alinsky said organizers have to have a blurred vision of the future, which is a good way of describing, we know where we're headed, but do we have a blueprint? Every time we construct a blueprint, we get into trouble because we start trying to fit people into boxes, and that usually takes coercion. And so that's not the direction. So I think embracing our capacity as learners, as human beings capable of connecting with each other, learning together, and finding the sources of power to, not just to fight back, but to create something that is good and that we know is good, and not cede the power of emotion to the other side. Boy, that's a problem. But to embrace it.
On that positive note, Marshall Ganz, first of all, thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you, Stephen.
I really greatly appreciate that, and so does all of our listeners of Socially Democratic. But second of all, can I say on a personal note, thank you for your leadership in enabling my leadership to achieve shared purpose, at many times under conditions of uncertainty, and the things that you've done to enable so many other leaders around the world. And organisers and coaches and trainers and teachers. It's a fantastic program that you run here. And if anyone wants to get involved, we'll put some details in the bio for today's podcast. How you can sign up for obviously the Leading Change Network, as well as signing up for the Public Narrative course, or the LOA, Leadership, Organising and Action, I should say, course here at Harvard.
And there needs to be an Australian version.
I did not know that.
There should be.
Oh, there should be. Oh,
Yeah,
absolutely.
yeah.
Well, someone said to me, the last sentence I'll say this. I was at a Labor Party state conference maybe 2 years ago, and someone said to me that I think that the community organising model's probably run its course and probably needs to, And I said, oh, no, we're just getting started.
Yeah.
We're just getting started because we've not mastered this craft. We need to continue to work at that practice.
And we need to learn from each other. The most inspiring thing in the online classes is Australian participation, because there's always a good crew from Australia where it's 1 o'clock in the morning.
Yeah, those times are brutal.
And it's amazing because it's like nobody else can ever complain of anything, because our Australian brothers and sisters are demonstrating the kind of sacrifice and commitment that it takes. It really is an inspiration. No kidding.
It's our pleasure.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks so much for this.
Thanks for listening. If you're interested in learning more about the organizing practices, please be sure to check out Leading Change Network website at leadingchangenetwork.org. We also invite you to join our community as organizations or individuals. Individual membership is $100 a year, and you can access all of our learning opportunities and resources and be part of our vibrant global community.